I am really pleased to be here with you today for this commemoration of Washington's 1790 dinner held at Morris-Jumel Mansion, and to have the honor of introducing our next guest speaker. With us today to discuss the creation and significance of Washington's first presidential cabinet is historian Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay is an expert on the cabinet, presidential history, and U.S. government institutions. She is currently the scholar in residence at the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies and the senior fellow at the International Center for Jefferson Studies. She received her BA in History and Political Science from the George Washington University and completed her master's and PhD from the University of California, Davis. Prior to joining the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies, she was a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University and a historian at the White House Historical Association. Her book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, was published by Harvard University Press on April 7th, 2020. When she's not writing, researching, or speaking about history, she loves to hike with her husband and her dog. I love this name, John Quincy Dog Adams. Welcome so much. Thank you for joining us, Lindsay, and for being a part of our event today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It is a thrill to be able to share with you a little bit about the president's cabinet and how it formed and the role of the dinner in 1790 to its formation. So the appropriate place, of course, to start, although I know some of these names have already been mentioned today, is who was actually in the president's cabinet. And so from left to right, and I also wanted to share a little bit about why they were selected and why they were there, because their personal relationships and their characteristics were really quite essential to the whole thing. So George Washington, of course, on the left, then Secretary of War Henry Knox. And Knox was one of Washington's closest friends. They first met in Massachusetts when Washington came up to take over control of the Continental Army. Knox kind of quickly gained in Washington's esteem when he led the mission to Fort Ticonderoga to capture the cannons and bring them back to Boston, which led to the successful ousting of the British Navy and Army from the city of Boston. He remained in the Army for the duration of the war, and he eventually ended up as the Major General of Artillery, and he was one of Washington's most trusted confidants. After the war, he served as the commander of West Point and then as the Secretary of War under the Confederation Congress before taking over that position for Washington as well. So he had an incredible amount of military knowledge, which of course Washington did too, but also an incredible amount of knowledge about the treaties and efforts at militia reform and relationships with Native Americans during the Confederation period, which were really essential to Washington's first couple of years of his presidency. Those were topics that were frequently discussed and often on their mind. Next, for those of you who are fans of Alexander Hamilton and Hamilton the musical, you probably don't need much of an introduction about his personality, but a little bit of background is always helpful. So Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury. He and Washington first met during the war when he became one of Washington's aides de camp. And he had a really brilliant financial mind, was very creative about the ways to come up with new solutions to economic challenges and ideas about how to right to the sort of very crumbling economy and credit that the new nation was facing. While Washington certainly understood these plans, he wasn't necessarily as creative about financial matters, and so that sort of additional knowledge was really essential. One to his right was the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. Washington and Jefferson knew each other from their time in Virginia and the Continental Congress. They had corresponded during the war while Jefferson served as the governor of Virginia. And then Jefferson went to France and to Europe to serve as a minister in a variety of different capacities. And that experience was really essential to his appointment. Washington only left the country once, and it was when he was a teenager and he went to Barbados. So he had never been to Versailles or the court of St. James. he didn't really know how diplomacy in Europe worked in terms of like a firsthand experience. And he didn't speak French, which was the language of diplomacy. So that sort of knowledge was really quite essential. And finally, Madison vouched for Jefferson and really suggested that he would be the perfect choice. And at this point, Washington really valued what Madison had to say. Finally, there is the Attorney General, Edmund Randolph. Now, while the Attorney General did not have a Department of Justice at that time, Edmund Randolph was certainly an equal among the advisors. He had a brilliant legal mind, and his input was so valued that even Hamilton and Jefferson, who had their own legal training, would often consult with him about constitutional questions or maybe legal issues pertaining to matters in their department. So he was a really important advisor, and he had actually been Washington's private attorney for several decades prior to coming into office. So they knew each other quite well. So where does this concept of a family dinner actually come from? When Washington was commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he regularly had family dinners with the officers and aides. He referred to them as his official family, and that was a practice he carried forward into the presidency. In addition to sort of the councils of war, which are depicted here, he understood that it was important to have social occasions and important emotional bonds between the officers to keep them together in the heat of battle, but also to smooth over some hurt feelings if there was a particularly contentious debate. So he often would take them out riding with him. They would have family dinners. They would socialize. They would drink tea. They would do all sorts of these activities. And especially during the winter, when they were at winter quarters, Washington would invite the officers to bring their wives. They would have balls and holiday gatherings. This picture is of Washington dancing, which he was a favorite among the ladies because he was so skilled on the dance floor. And so this was a really essential part of Washington's war practice. It was something he knew that he really needed to do in order to keep the officer corps together. So when Washington was then in office as president, he continued many of those same practices. He viewed the secretaries as his official family and often called them the gentlemen of my family in his correspondence. This picture, which we actually just learned about a lot of these items that were on Washington's table. This is what the table would have looked like in the president's house in first New York and then Philadelphia. And this was where Washington hosted his weekly state dinners, which usually took place on Thursday evenings. He would invite visiting dignitaries, diplomats, congressmen, justices of the Supreme Court, local businessmen, friends, family, and then of course, department secretaries and their wives. And he kept pretty careful notes about who he was inviting to make sure he wasn't insulting anyone in the other branches of government and to sort of balance out some of those personalities. And these meals served a number of important purposes. One, they built that same sort of esprit de corps that he had found so valuable during the war. But Washington wasn't particularly known for his public speaking. He didn't really always like being the center of attention. He didn't like having to have the burden of giving toasts, which were a very important part of the meal, or leading the conversation. And so by having the secretaries there, they could sort of act as unofficial hosts or fill in for him. And since Hamilton was never short on words, he had no problem playing this particular role. He also would take the secretaries and their wives to the theater. Washington loved the theater and basically had a box wherever he was and would frequently invite John Adams and Abigail Adams and the Hamiltons and the Knoxes and the Randolphs, as well as other congressmen and justices or visiting dignitaries. They would go out horseback riding to visit gardens or military sites like the one that they visited at Fort Washington before they went to the dinner at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And he invited them on all these activities because he did think that it would help when they got into the actual room to discuss issues if they liked each other. Now, a little bit of a spoiler alert, this didn't work very well. It worked a lot better in the war than it did during the presidency because Hamilton and Jefferson ended up despising each other. But he had the best of intentions. One other important event that I want to mention are Martha Washington's Friday afternoon drawing rooms. And these events were essential because women were present. And so because women were there, they were semi-private, semi-public events. They were not considered to be political in any way. And so that meant, and also Martha was the host. So that meant that George was essentially just an average person. Of course he wasn't, but in theory, he was an average person. And because women were there in theory, wasn't going to be conversation about politics. Now, we of course know that that's rubbish because women had just as many ideas about politics then as they do now, and frequently the conversation would turn to whatever issue was at hand. But the way that these events were set up allowed Washington and the secretaries, who were regular guests, to go up to congressmen and sort of subtly say what they wanted to have happen on a particular bill. And had it been an all-male event, that would have been considered very inappropriate because Washington would have been interfering in congressional affairs. He would have been politicking at a public event. It would have been very, very inappropriate and very much not okay and very much criticized. But because they did so in the presence of women and at these particular events, it was acceptable. So when they got to this dinner in 1790 at the Morris-Jumel Mansion and they sat down, what may they have been talking about? What sort of issues would have been on the agenda? There were certainly a lot of potential options and a lot of controversial ones. So perhaps they reflected on their experiences from the war, especially because they had just toured the remains of Fort Washington. Maybe they told some old war stories or talked about friends that they had known well from that time. It's possible they talked about the recent theater that they may have attended or some events that were coming up because the capital city at this point was still in New York, and so there was much theater to attend. It's also possible that they did talk about politics. I don't think that they would have had a full-blown conversation at this point about diplomacy or these other issues because women were present, because there were servants and enslaved individuals who were milling about, and potentially the hosts of the dinner were there. And so it wouldn't have been a full-on business meeting, but it's likely that perhaps the sort of contentious relationships with Spain and Great Britain and France would have come up. It's possible they would have talked about both the Residence Act and the Assumption Bill, which were the two big bills coming up that were captured in the Room Where It Happens song in Hamilton, that compromise that they made. Those bills, the first was passed just the week after this dinner, and the second was passed about a month later. So it is certainly possible there was conversation about where the government would go next, where would be the next seat of government, and where they would all have to move to and find new homes. Unfortunately, we don't have much of a record of what they chatted about. So it's certainly safe to say that they definitely discussed the weather and their health of their families, because those were always safe topics and ones that were very frequently discussed. So I would be remiss if I didn't say that in 1790, there actually wasn't a cabinet yet. There is a specification in Article 2 of the Constitution that says that the president may request written advice from the department secretaries about issues pertaining to their departments. And Washington entered into the office really intending to follow this prescription to the sort of the letter of the law. And it was very intentionally crafted by the department secretaries because they didn't want there to be a cabinet. They explicitly rejected a proposal for a cabinet because they felt like it would obscure transparency at the highest levels of government. There wouldn't be evidence about who said what and who advocated which position. And they wanted to know who to hold accountable for bad choices. And so Washington very intentionally did not create a cabinet, even though he may have wanted one, because that was so similar to his Council of War experience. So he actually went 2.5 years before convening an official cabinet meeting, and that didn't happen until November 26th, 1791. So they definitely socialized before this. They definitely were in the same place. They definitely talked, but there wasn't that sort of official get-together to talk about big issues that were facing the executive branch until that point. And this moment was a really huge one. They would have met in Washington's private study in the president's house on the second floor. At this point, the seat of government had moved to Philadelphia. So this is the house that's on the corner of 6th and High or 6th and Market Streets, where if you go visit today, you can still see that location. The room was about 15 by 21 feet, so it was pretty small. It was quite full of furniture. And there would have been 5 very large men in this room. We know that Washington was very tall for the time, so was Jefferson. There's already been some conversation, I think, in the comments and chat section about Knox's size. And so this room would have been quite squishy, and personal space would have been hard to come by. Certainly no social distancing by 2020 standards. And that was probably okay for the first couple of cabinet meetings, but by 1793, when France had declared war on Great Britain and the country was desperately sort of trying to stay out of it, it would have gotten a little bit trickier, and they ended up meeting 51 times in that year, including up to 5 times per week in the summer for several hours a day in this space. Hamilton and Jefferson at this point despised each other, and they were locked in this room without air conditioning. And we know from Jefferson's notes that at one point on one particular meeting, Hamilton decided to speak for 45 minutes without interruption. And we know from other sources that when he talked, he tended to gesticulate wildly and he tended to pace. So imagine someone in this room pacing for 45 minutes, giving a speech, and you are so tired of meeting with them, you can just kind of see Jefferson's head exploding. So it would have been quite a tense atmosphere. But Washington found it to be really helpful because he had intentionally brought together this group of people with different perspectives and different experiences, and he wanted to hear from them. He wanted to know what they had to say. He wanted to learn about all the different options and then pick the best choice based on all of that information. So a cabinet was really essential to his form of leadership and the type of president he wanted to be. So as they so kindly mentioned in the introduction, I do have a book out about the cabinet, and I think it's actually available in the Morris-Jumel shop. Unfortunately, oh, thank you, there's the book. Unfortunately, I can't sign them for you, which I wish I could do, but I came up with a little option instead. And I had this book plate designed, which has a little hound on it. And I have a hound on it because Washington loved hounds, he loved dogs, and he created the American Foxhound breed, which unbeknownst to me, I did not know that when I rescued my dog, John Quincy Dog Adams. And John Quincy Dog Adams is also an American Foxhound. So in homage to my dog and Washington's creation of this breed, there's a little hound. If you go to the link on the screen, which is just lindsaychervinsky.com/bookplate, you can put your information in and I will send you a personalized signed bookplate to thank you for being here and paying attention and being interested in cabinet history. That is such a gift. And so now I'm thrilled to hear your questions. I always find the question and answer portion actually to be my favorite because I want to know what you want to know about.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsay, for such a fascinating conversation. And thank you for kindly being here. And I think that bookplate idea is very generous. And
oh, my pleasure.
I have been monitoring the chat.
Wonderful.
So we are definitely going to circle back to Lin-Manuel's Miranda's Hamilton shortly. But going back to the dinner itself, you were talking about how the Washingtons, both George and Martha, would frequently hold either dinners or Martha's afternoons to sort of facilitate relationships amongst members of the government. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about, at least in this particular instance, to your knowledge, would the Washington family and other secretaries have traveled sort of with an entourage of staff or enslaved people who would do the manual labor that was necessary to put on such an event? Or was something like this, incumbent upon the host site for these tasks?
Sure, it's a great question. It's such a good one because it is really important to acknowledge the people who don't necessarily show up as much in the letters, but were definitely present.
Mhm.
So it's likely that the host would have had some sort of staff, maybe a mix of hired servants or enslaved individuals, or potentially hired enslaved individuals from other people and paid their owners for their service on that particular night. The host probably would have been responsible for the labor to produce the meal and serve the guests who were there. That being said, the Washingtons almost always traveled with at least a couple of people. They usually came with whoever happened to be Washington's enslaved manservant or valet at the time, who I believe in 1790 would have been Christopher Shields. So he pretty much went anywhere that Washington went. Similarly, Martha probably would have brought Ona Judge with her, who was sort of her, the enslaved maid that she brought that had the fanciest clothes and the fanciest shoes and attended her in spaces where it was sort of a public space. Ona Judge was sort of made, was brought to so many of us, their attention by the book by Erica Armstrong Dunbar called Never Caught. And it's about Ona's story and how she ran away and was basically able to secure freedom for herself. And it's actually going to be made into a movie. So that's going to be an incredible story.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and so depending on what transportation they took, my understanding is they probably took the carriage on that particular day because Martha didn't usually ride. That meant there would have been at least a couple of other enslaved men that accompanied the carriage because there was usually one person driving it and then at least one other person that would have attended to the doors and attended to the horses once they arrived, made sure they had water and food and a comfortable place to rest until they had to return. So that was certainly true for the Washingtons. There would have been some similar arrangement for many of the other families. Now, the Adamses didn't own enslaved people. They did sometimes rent them out, depending on what city they were in. They had usually a mix of free and hired enslaved individuals, but they too would have had a carriage. Same for pretty much every family. So every family would have had some sort of staff. The Jays were probably the most ardent abolitionists of the attendees. And so they probably would have had strictly hired servants, but everyone else probably had some sort of mix.
Speaking of the Jays and abolition, I mean, would the presence or absence of enslaved or hired enslaved people as part of these entourages been points of friction perhaps amongst any of the participants, or did they sort of gloss that over with a lot of formality and etiquette?
It's a great question. It's kind of hard to know because they tended to not talk about the more uncomfortable subjects in their recollections of the dinner. In a recent book that was published, Ed Larson suggested that maybe when Washington went to visit Benjamin Franklin, he would go on foot or on horseback so that he wouldn't have to be accompanied by enslaved individuals to drive the carriage, because Franklin had become more outspokenly abolitionist. And so sort of because Washington was going to Franklin's home, he sort of paid homage to that position. That being said, all of the attendees of the dinner were also attendees at dinners that Washington hosted. And most of the people that worked in Washington's president's house were enslaved. He did occasionally hire out chefs and hire out other people, but most of the people were enslaved. And there doesn't seem to be, certainly some of his friends at times pushed him to consider manumission and to consider some ways to fight against slavery, but it doesn't seem to have been a daily source of friction around the dinner table.
Great. So we have a question from Anne in the chat. When the Capitol was in New York City, did all of the cabinet members live there? Or were they sort of splitting the distance between their home estates and here?
Great question. So all of the secretaries did live in the city wherever the seat of government happened to be for both New York and for Philadelphia. Some brought their families with them and rented homes and sort of made, a really home space in those particular spots. Others chose to leave their families back at their real home and sort of have a much smaller dwelling, maybe for cost purposes. For example, Edmund Randolph did this because he was chronically short on money. He had a lot of land and he owned a lot of enslaved people, but he was very sort of cash poor. And so it was easier for him to have a very small place to live in New York and Philadelphia and leave his family at home. But all of the secretaries were in the capital city, wherever it happened to be, especially as long as Congress was in session, but usually they were there almost year round, except for maybe one vacation in the summer.